They called him a phantom, invisible, untouchable, and unstoppable. One eye, 1-0, and a will of iron. This is Saburo Sakai's story. Before the Pacific sky burned with tracer fire and falling wings, before the roar of engines became the soundtrack of survival, there was a boy born into a nation preparing for war long before the world realized it. Saburo Sakai entered history not as a legend, but as a product of Imperial Japan, an empire driven by honor, discipline, and an unyielding belief that sacrifice was the highest virtue. In the early decades of the 20th century, Japan was rising fast, transforming itself from an island nation into a militarized power determined to command the skies and seas of Asia. Aviation was no longer a curiosity. It was destiny. The Imperial Japanese Navy understood something many nations would learn too late. Air power would decide the future of warfare. Long before Pearl Harbor, long before the names Guadalcanal and Rabaul became synonymous with death, Japan invested in pilots as elite warriors. To fly was not merely a skill, it was a calling. Naval aviators were forged through brutal training programs designed to break the weak and harden the strong. Only a fraction survived the process. Those who did emerged as something closer to weapons than men. Saburo Sakai was one of them. Born in 1916 to a poor family, Sakai's early life was shaped by hardship, discipline, and an almost religious devotion to authority. In Imperial Japan, obedience was survival. At 16, Sakai enlisted in the Navy, enduring beatings, starvation, and humiliation as part of basic training. Weakness was punished. Pain was instruction. Survival meant silence. This environment did not produce compassionate men, but it produced relentless ones. Sakai learned early that endurance mattered more than talent, and that quitting was not an option. When Sakai entered flight training, he entered a world even harsher. Aviation cadets were expected to memorize aircraft systems blindfolded, navigate by stars and instinct, and endure constant physical punishment. Accidents were common. Death was accepted. Pilots were expendable, unless they proved themselves exceptional. Sakai did. His reflexes were sharp, his vision extraordinary, and his will unbreakable. He graduated as a naval fighter pilot at a time when Japan possessed what many considered the finest carrier-based fighter aircraft on Earth. That aircraft was the Mitsubishi A6M0. The Zero was unlike anything its enemies had seen. Where Western aircraft emphasized armor, firepower, and survivability, the Zero embraced speed, agility, and range. It was light, dangerously so. Armor was sacrificed. Self-sealing fuel tanks were ignored. But in return, the Zero could outturn, outclimb, and outmaneuver nearly every opponent it faced in the early years of the war. It was a blade in the sky, lethal, elegant, and unforgiving. To fly the Zero effectively required skill bordering on obsession. It rewarded precision and punished mistakes. Pilots who respected it became deadly. Those who didn't died quickly. Sakai understood the Zero intuitively. He treated it not as a machine, but as an extension of his own body. Every vibration, every change in airflow spoke to him. In the cockpit, Sakai felt complete. By 1941, Sakai was stationed in the South Pacific, flying combat missions over China and later Southeast Asia. When Japan launched its massive offensive across the Pacific, Sakai was already a veteran. While the world focused on Pearl Harbor, Sakai was fighting brutal air battles far from headlines, shooting down enemy aircraft and perfecting his craft. He was not yet famous, but he was already lethal. The Pacific War was different from anything Europe experienced. Vast distances, isolated islands, endless ocean. Pilots often flew for hours with no guarantee of return. Navigation errors meant death. Mechanical failure meant drowning. And unlike European skies crowded with radar and airfields, Pacific combat was intimate, savage, and unforgiving. Dogfights were often decided in seconds. There were no second chances. Sakai thrived in this environment. As Allied forces advanced, the Zero's early dominance began to face resistance. American pilots learned, slowly, painfully, That turning with the zero meant death. New tactics emerged. Speed dives, energy fighting, team maneuvers like the Thatch Weave. But in the early years, before the balance shifted, pilots like Sakai ruled the sky. His kill count climbed. His confidence hardened. Yet beneath the victories was a growing shadow. War was changing faster than doctrine could adapt. Despite his success, Sakai was not immune to doubt. Unlike propaganda posters, real pilots saw death up close. Friends vanished into the sea. Squadrons thinned. Replacement pilots arrived with less training, less experience, and less time. The Imperial Navy had built elite warriors, but it had failed to build a system to replace them. Every loss mattered. Every veteran killed weakened Japan's future. Sakai sensed it. Even if he couldn't articulate it fully. WWII 1942, the Pacific sky was becoming more crowded, more dangerous. American aircraft were improving. Radar-guided interceptions increased. Anti-aircraft fire grew more accurate. The Zero remained agile, but its weaknesses were becoming deadly liabilities. One bullet in the wrong place could ignite the aircraft instantly. Sakai knew this. Every mission became a calculated risk. And then came August 7, 1942, the day that would define Saburo Sakai forever. As Allied forces landed on Guadalcanal, Sakai was scrambled to intercept enemy aircraft. It was supposed to be routine. Another mission. Another chance to prove himself. But war has no respect for experience, and fate does not warn its victims. High above the island, Sakai engaged American fighters in a chaotic dogfight. Tracers cut the sky. Engines screamed. Suddenly, a burst of machine gun fire tore through Sakai's Zero. A bullet shattered his canopy. Another ripped through his skull, but he did not die. Instead, blood flooded his cockpit. One eye was destroyed instantly. His face was torn open. Brain matter exposed. Most pilots would have lost consciousness in seconds. Sakai did not. Somehow, through sheer will or something darker, he remained awake. Flying blind in one eye, half-conscious, hemorrhaging at altitude, Saburo Sakai refused to die. What followed was not just a flight. It was a legend in the making. And that legend is where the real story begins. The sky above Guadalcanal on that August morning was a canvas of fire, wind, and steel. A theater where every pilot understood that hesitation meant death. The sun rose pale and almost indifferent over the Pacific, illuminating the chaotic scene below. A flotilla of American transport ships disgorging soldiers, naval artillery preparing to fire, and dozens of enemy aircraft lifting from makeshift airstrips. To Saburo Sakai, it was a scene both terrifying and beautiful, a battlefield that demanded absolute focus. Every twist of the Zero's stick, every adjustment of the throttle, could determine whether he would live or die. As Sakai climbed into the thin morning air, the world beneath him seemed impossibly small. The vast ocean shimmered with sunlight, waves rippling like silver scales. Yet in this calm, he knew death waited. Reports from earlier sorties warned of new American tactics: coordinated fighter patrols, aggressive bomber escorts, and skilled pilots with unfamiliar aircraft. Grumman F-4F Wildcats. Agile, heavily armed, and surprisingly resilient. This was no longer the early war Pacific, where a Zero could dominate with ease. Now, every engagement required cunning, reflexes, and a willingness to gamble with life itself. Sakai's squadron formed a tight V, wings slicing the air with practiced precision. Their mission was simple in theory: intercept incoming American planes, prevent bombers from reaching the naval fleet, and defend Japanese positions on the island. In practice, it was chaos. 30 Zeros against a dozen or more Wildcats and bombers, weaving and diving in a deadly ballet of machine guns, propellers, and tracer fire. Every pilot was acutely aware that a single miscalculation could rip him from the sky into the unforgiving Pacific waters below. As the first American formations appeared, the tension became almost tangible. Bombers lumbered forward, heavy with ordnance, while Wildcats darted like predators, sweeping through the sky in search of targets. Sakai's squadron moved as one, coordinated and precise, banking sharply, climbing steeply, and then diving toward the enemy with a predator's grace. The first encounter erupted in a violent storm of gunfire. Tracer bullets arced through the sky like streaking lightning, punctuated by explosions as aircraft were shredded midair. The roar of engines was deafening, punctuated by the sharp crack of gunfire. Sakai's instincts took over. He engaged a wildcat that cut across his formation, tracking its movements, predicting its maneuvers before they happened. The Zero responded like an extension of his body, twisting, banking, diving, and climbing with a grace that made the American pilot seem clumsy, even as bullets whined past his fuselage. He fired, and the Wildcat erupted in flames, its pilot ejecting over the ocean. The taste of victory was immediate, yet there was no time to savor it. The sky offered no respite. Enemy aircraft surged in, and the fight became a whirlwind, a blur of wings, fire, and adrenaline. But the battle was far from over. Sakai soon spotted a second Wildcat, faster and more cautious, circling with deadly patience. As he engaged, he realized his targeting was compromised. A sharp sting erupted in his face, his helmet's visor shattered. A bullet had struck his eye. Pain and confusion flashed through him, but training, discipline, and sheer willpower held him in control. Blood clouded his vision. Every movement became more difficult, yet he refused to relinquish control. The sky demanded dominance, not surrender, and he would not, fall. With one eye destroyed and the other barely able to track the enemy, Sakai executed a series of maneuvers that would later become legendary. Diving steeply toward the ocean, then climbing sharply in an unpredictable arc, he evaded several Wildcats converging on his position. Each maneuver was a gamble, each second a tightrope walk over death. Enemy pilots were stunned. No man should survive such an injury, let alone remain combat effective. Yet Sakai's sheer determination and instinct kept him alive, guiding the Zero as if it were an extension of his own wounded body. As the battle raged, Sakai's squadron attempted to regroup. Pilots communicated in brief bursts, their voices tense over the radio. Some were wounded, others panicked. Despite the carnage, Sakai maintained a calmness that inspired his comrades. His leadership in that moment was not by rank, but by example, unyielding courage in the face of annihilation. American pilots, meanwhile, sensed something extraordinary, a Japanese ace who fought with an almost supernatural tenacity. It was the kind of ferocity that would haunt their memories long after the war. Eventually, Sakai realized that continuing the engagement risked certain death. With skill and ingenuity, he disengaged, flying low over the Pacific to avoid enemy radar and visual detection. The Zero, damaged but still flying, became a lifeline, carrying him back to Japanese-controlled territory. Hours later, he crash-landed on a makeshift airfield, barely conscious, one eye destroyed, his body riddled with shrapnel and wounds. Medical personnel worked frantically to save him, but even in pain, Sakai's first thought was of the next mission, the next fight, the next chance to defend his nation. This battle, chaotic and deadly, became a defining moment in Sakai's career. It revealed not just his skill as a pilot, but his extraordinary resilience and courage. Where others would have succumbed, he endured. Where others would have surrendered, he persevered. The enemy pilots who faced him would recount his ferocity, the near-impossible maneuvers, the unshakable focus of a man refusing to die. Guadalcanal became more than a battlefield. It became a proving ground, where legends were forged in fire and steel. And yet, despite the heroics and triumphs, Sakai's journey was far from over. The wounds he suffered were a constant reminder of mortality, a shadow that would follow him in every sortie, every engagement, every encounter with death in the Pacific skies. The real test, beyond tactics, beyond kills, was survival, and Saburo Sakai would continue to redefine the limits of human endurance. The Pacific sky over Guadalcanal was no longer a serene blue. It had become a hellish theater of smoke, fire, and screaming engines. Every cloud was a potential ambush, every glint of sunlight off metal a warning of death. Saburo Sakai, one-eyed but unbowed, climbed into the heavens once more, the Zero's engine screaming as if it sensed its master's urgency. His wounds throbbed, yet adrenaline sharpened every sense. Today, survival would not be enough. Today, he would dance with death and turn the impossible into legend. As the first American formations appeared on the horizon, Sakai tightened his grip on the stick. A squadron of F-4F Wildcats, their wings gleaming under the tropical sun, advanced with calculated aggression. American pilots had heard the rumors of the one-eyed Japanese ace, but in the heat of battle, there was no time to worry about stories. Skill and speed would decide life or death. Sakai's Zero surged forward, banking sharply to evade a burst of machine gun fire. The tracers scorched the air around him. A direct hit could tear the aircraft apart. The first kill came swiftly. Spotting a lone wildcat attempting to flank him, Sakai maneuvered with unearthly precision. Diving steeply, he let gravity add speed to the Zero's already superior agility. At the last possible moment, he rolled the aircraft, aligning his guns with the unsuspecting enemy. 3 short bursts, and the Wildcat spiraled downward, smoke trailing like a black ribbon across the sky. Sakai barely had time to savor the moment. Another Wildcat approached, faster, angrier, and more cautious. Now began a dance of death that would etch itself into legend. Sakai executed a series of maneuvers that defied physics and logic. A sudden climb, a near-vertical stall, a rapid barrel roll. Each action countered the enemy's pursuit, each movement calculated to exploit the Zero's strengths. American pilots were forced to break off or risk collision. One by one, he engaged, firing short, deadly bursts, often from positions that seemed impossible. Observers later described these dogfights as almost choreographed, a deadly ballet where the line between skill and luck blurred. At one point, Sakai found himself facing 2 Wildcats simultaneously. His Zero's agility became both shield and weapon. He dived toward the ocean, baiting the enemy into overcommitment, then rolled sharply and climbed behind one of the attackers. A short burst of fire, and flames erupted from the Wildcat's engine. The other pilot broke formation, terrified by the precision and audacity of the one-eyed Japanese ace. Sakai's colleagues, inspired by his maneuvers, followed suit, executing attacks with newfound confidence. But heroics came with a price. During the climax of this engagement, Sakai's Zero was hit multiple times. Bullets tore through the fuselage, wing surfaces shuddered under fire, and smoke filled the cockpit. His one functional eye struggled to track the enemy. He was physically compromised, yet mentally razor-sharp. In a moment that would define him, Sakai initiated what would later be called a miraculous escape, a high-speed, low-altitude dive toward a coral reef, pulling up at the last possible instant to avoid disaster. The pursuing Wildcats were caught off guard, overshot their mark, and Sakai vanished into the thickening smoke of the battlefield. Amidst the chaos, he continued to tally kills with unmatched efficiency. Enemy aircraft fell one after another, their pilots either ejecting or plummeting into the Pacific's unforgiving depths. Each maneuver was a testament to his training, intuition, and the sheer bond between pilot and machine. The Zero responded like a living entity, twisting and diving with a grace that no Western aircraft could match. In the sky above Guadalcanal, legend and reality converged. Saburo Sakai became more than a man. He became an avatar of the war itself. The climax of the battle came when Sakai engaged a formation of 4 bombers attempting to strike Japanese positions. With limited ammunition, a mangled fuselage, and agonizing pain from his wounds, he attacked. Using the sun to blind the gunners, he wove between defensive fire, targeting engines, fuselage, and wings with surgical precision. One bomber caught fire midair, another was forced into a crash landing. His comrades, witnessing this, were galvanized, attacking with renewed vigor, inspired by the ferocity and near-superhuman skill of their ace. As the battle concluded, Sakai's Zero was a wounded beast, riddled with bullet holes, leaking fuel, and blackened by smoke. Yet it carried him safely back to Japanese lines. His body trembled, his face drenched in sweat and blood, yet his spirit remained unbroken. He had achieved the impossible, fought through extreme injury, inflicted devastating losses on the enemy, and returned alive. In that moment, the Pacific War had not only produced a hero, it had produced a myth. By nightfall, stories of the one-eyed ace spread through Japanese squadrons. Pilots whispered of his courage, his cunning, and the audacity of a man who defied death itself. In America, reports surfaced of an enemy pilot who seemed to vanish into thin air, striking like a phantom and eluding destruction. Sakai's exploits would echo across both sides of the war, a symbol of individual skill and relentless determination. Yet even in victory, he felt the heavy toll of war. The faces of fallen comrades, the screams of pilots plunging into the sea, and the constant brush with mortality weighed on him. Heroism in the sky was inseparable from tragedy. Each victory was both triumph and reminder of fragility. But Sakai endured, and the legend of the one-eyed Japanese ace, who refused to die, was forever cemented in the annals of aerial warfare. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the Pacific in shades of molten gold and crimson, the island of Guadalcanal lay scarred. Ships smoldered in shallow waters, forests bore the wounds of artillery, and the air still carried the acrid smell of gunpowder and aviation fuel. For Saburo Sakai, the day's carnage weighed heavily, far beyond the physical pain that pulsed in his body. The battlefield was no longer just a test of skill. It had become a canvas of survival, heroism, and tragedy. His mind replayed every maneuver, every death, every near miss in excruciating detail. Though the Zero had carried him home once again, the war had already claimed so much. His comrades, their youthful lives snatched in moments of chaos, the innocence of the sky forever shattered. Strategically, Sakai's heroics were a double-edged sword. The Imperial Japanese Navy still valued the Zero's agility and his exceptional skill, yet each battle underscored a growing imbalance. Allied pilots were learning quickly, adapting tactics, and gaining experience at a rate Japan could not match. Guadalcanal itself marked a turning point in the Pacific War. Control of the island meant control of supply routes, airfields, and the initiative in the Solomon Islands. Though Sakai's squadron inflicted devastating losses on the enemy, the overall trajectory of the conflict was shifting. Japanese dominance of the sky was no longer absolute. Even the most skilled pilots faced a war increasingly stacked against them. Absolute. Even the most skilled pilots faced a war increasingly stacked against them. Psychologically, Sakai's feats left an indelible impression on both sides of the conflict. For Japanese aviators, he became a symbol of endurance, courage, and the terrifying heights of human capability under pressure. Squadron mates spoke of him with reverence, recounting moments when a single eye and a mangled body did not impede his precision or judgment. For American pilots, reports of a seemingly invincible, one-eyed adversary haunted their briefings and sleep. Saburo Sakai became more than a man. He was a legend, a phantom in the skies whose very presence altered the way opponents approached combat. Every sortie carried the weight of expectation, every encounter with the enemy a test of nerve and ingenuity. Yet amid the legend, the human cost remained stark. The trauma of near-death experiences, the endless rhythm of aerial combat, and the psychological strain of witnessing the deaths of comrades and foes alike left scars invisible to the outside world. Sakai's survival was miraculous, but it was never without consequence. He grappled with grief, pain, and the existential weight of living while so many others perished. His story was not just one of heroism, but a testament to the fragility and resilience of life in the most extreme conditions. In the cinematic lens of history, Saburo Sakai's narrative reaches its apex in that fragile tension between mortality and legend. His life embodied the paradox of war, beauty and horror intertwined, courage interlaced with fear, triumph shadowed by loss. The Pacific sky, once a theater of youth and aspiration, had become a crucible where only the extraordinary survived. Sakai's journey, through blinding injury, impossible odds, and relentless dogfights, epitomized the very essence of aerial warfare, a dance with death in which skill, instinct, and sheer will determined fate. As the camera pans over Guadalcanal's horizon, the sun finally sinks beneath the ocean, leaving only silhouettes of palm trees, smoke, and distant wreckage. The wind carries whispers of stories untold, of pilots who flew too high, too fast, and too bravely to be forgotten. Saburo Sakai, the one-eyed ace who refused to die, emerges from the shadows of history not merely as a pilot, but as a symbol, a cinematic embodiment of heroism, endurance, and the human spirit's refusal to surrender, even when the skies themselves seem determined to claim it. The echoes of his engine, the fire of his victories, and the scars of his losses linger, immortalized in the annals of World War II aviation. His story reminds us that heroism is often born in the crucible of pain, and that even in the most merciless theaters of war, a single individual can redefine the boundaries of courage, skill, and survival. Saburo Sakai is not just a name. He is a legend that continues to soar, long after the guns have fallen silent, long after the smoke has cleared, and long after the Pacific sky has claimed countless others.